Let's dive right in. Today we're unpacking a massive, incredibly complex socio-ecological shift that's actively transforming Indonesia's tropical uplands. Right now, across landscapes that historically were dominated by lush, highly diverse coffee agroforestry systems, smallholder farmers are actually tearing up those plants. Why? To make way for monoculture oil palm. It's a huge land use transition, and managing it really requires us to completely rethink how we govern these spaces. So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the reality of the transition, then look at the ecological and economic impacts, explore the limitations of current policy perspectives, give an overview of a place-based strategy, and finally dive into three main strategy pathways.
All right, starting off with Section 1, the reality of the transition.
To truly grasp what's going on, we have to zoom in on the ground reality. Take regions like Kanan, for example. The dynamics there are common across the tropics. You see, farmers aren't just making random choices here. Their decisions are driven by real, structural economic pressures. Traditional coffee is labor-intensive and suffers from crazy market price volatility. Oil palm, on the other hand, offers relatively stable, predictable income, which is a lifesaver when labor is tight. So these farmers are making entirely rational economic choices to survive. They're basically trading unpredictable volatility for steady stability. And when we look at the landscape itself, you can clearly see how this plays out spatially. It is not uniform at all. The conversion to oil palm is heavily concentrated in the highly accessible lowlands, where roads make transport a breeze. But as you move up the elevation gradient into the steep, ecologically sensitive uplands, the pressure really starts mounting. Those lush, mountainous coffee systems, they are literally the next frontier for conversion if we don't step in smartly.
That brings us to Section 2, the ecological and economic impacts. Now, this transition is a classic double-edged sword. On the ecological front, we're facing severe landscape homogenization. Those incredibly diverse, ecologically rich agroforestry systems up in the sensitive uplands are being wiped out and replaced by homogenized single-commodity plantations. And we aren't just talking about losing a few trees here. This is a massive reduction in vital ecosystem services, and the ecological cost is especially severe in those steep, high-elevation zones. But then we have the economic reality, which is honestly a bit of a paradox. You see, household incomes actually tend to rise when farmers switch to oil palm. Sounds great, right? Well, it comes at a major hidden cost. Families suddenly become completely dependent on a single commodity. Their livelihood diversity just shrinks, which drastically increases their vulnerability to future market shocks. It is the ultimate case of putting all your eggs in one basket. Let's move to Section 3, the limitations of current policy perspectives. We have to zoom out for a second and ask, why hasn't this transition been managed better? Honestly, it's because there's a massive mismatch between policy and reality. Current policies rely heavily on uniform, static zoning or just these blanket regulatory bans. But the reality on the ground is totally different. We're dealing with high spatial heterogeneity, incredibly complex socio-ecological interactions, and farmers who are just utilizing rational survival strategies. The policies right now are basically blunt instruments. They completely fail to account for the massive differences between, say, a flat lowland valley and a steep mountain slope. Which leads us to a really crucial question. If uniform regulations are failing because they don't address the actual economic and institutional roots of a farmer's decision, how do we design the right strategy for this incredibly diverse landscape? And more importantly, how do we pull that off without villainizing the smallholder farmers who are literally just trying to make a living?
And that brings us to Section 4, our strategy overview for a place-based approach.
The solution here demands a complete paradigm shift towards what we call place-based land governance. This means our strategy actually has to be derived from spatial, institutional, and livelihood evidence and tailored specifically to the varying conditions of the landscape. It requires a locally tailored theory of change. This proves that governance has to move way beyond single-issue regulations. Instead, we need to interact directly with the spatial, economic, and institutional levers that actually drive household decisions. Things like spatial access, price signals, and education are what shape these choices, which then lead to different land use trajectories. If we want to make a difference, our interventions have to target those exact levers.
So let's look at Section 5, the three main strategy pathways.
Based on all this evidence, researchers have put together a highly actionable approach to manage this transition comprehensively. It relies on three strategic pillars: spatial, livelihood, and institutional strategies, and they're designed to work together harmoniously. You can't just slap down a spatial plan without also supporting the livelihoods and building the institutions of these farming communities. So let's break down exactly what each of these means in practice.
First up is the spatial strategy. We already know that rigid blanket bans just don't work. So instead, this approach uses soft zoning. It takes up-to-date land cover data to allow for controlled, managed oil palm development in the less sensitive, highly accessible lowlands. But at the exact same time, it fiercely protects the coffee agroforestry systems up in the steep, ecologically critical uplands. It actually adapts to the landscape.
Second is the livelihood strategy. Because income stability is the absolute biggest driver of land conversion, we have to tackle that economic vulnerability head on. This pathway provides real incentives for diversification. We're talking about promoting intercropping with residual coffee, exploring non-farm income streams, and utilizing contract-based cooperative sales. The whole goal here is to buffer farmers against unpredictable market crashes so they never feel forced to convert every last inch of their land to palm just to survive.
Finally, we have the institutional strategy. Analysis shows that education and the functionality of farmer groups are massive drivers of land use decisions. So this strategy focuses heavily on practical field-based training. But more importantly, it transforms these farmer groups. It takes them from being basically just seed and fertilizer distributors and turns them into robust organizations that are fully capable of collective risk management, internal governance, and actually having real bargaining power in the broader market. The ultimate payoff of all this is a perfectly tailored governance matrix. It organizes governance across 4 different quadrants based on current land use and institutional capacity. For example, if a community is caught in a vulnerable conversion trap with very low capacity, they get targeted stabilization and diversification support. But if they have high capacity and still have intact agroforestry, the focus shifts to ecosystem service incentives. It literally gives policymakers a perfectly tailored roadmap. The evidence we've seen is abundantly clear. Uniform policies have unequivocally failed to protect both farmers and forests in these incredibly diverse uplands. We have the data, we have the spatial mapping, and we have the livelihood models. So, knowing what we know now, are we finally ready to shift to a governance strategy that recognizes the true face of our landscapes?